It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the ViewSonic XG270QC. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, processing done by YouTube, and ultimately on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on. So in no way is it an accurate representation of exactly what the monitor looks like firsthand. As usual, there's also a full written review accompanying this video review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. This monitor uses a 27-inch VA panel with a 165Hz refresh rate and a 2560 by 1440 WQHD resolution. It also has a 1500R curve to it. So just focusing on that curve briefly, it's something which really looks very much exaggerated in videos and pictures of the monitor. It kind of has this pincushion effect. You don't actually see that when you're just sitting in front of the monitor using it normally. So it actually is something which I adapt to very quickly, or I adapted to very quickly in this case, and I have with other curved monitors of this kind of curvature. So it really becomes very natural and just kind of draws you into the experience a little bit, gives you a slight extra feeling of depth, but it doesn't make things look distorted and weird as you might think if you look at some of these pictures and videos. And this is something which others agree with, who I've communicated with respect to curved monitors that they've tried. They're often put off by how the curve looks in pictures of the monitor and that kind of thing, but when they actually sit in front of it, they're surprised by how subtle the effect is. So don't be put off that aspect. The WQHD resolution, 2560 by 1440, that gives you a good amount of desktop real estate and a good pixel density to work with. So just in terms of the real estate, good multitasking potential there. It's certainly a big upgrade from the full HD resolution in that respect. For me personally, I'm quite spoilt. I'm used to these high resolutions, this or even higher in some cases. And when I review or use a full HD monitor, I find it really restrictive on the desktop for this reason. So I find it much nicer in terms of the real estate at your disposal for multitasking. This kind of resolution. Just as a quick aside here as well, if you see any dancing lines on the video at various points, that's just moire from the camera. It isn't something you observe on the monitor itself, so don't worry about that. The screen surface is something I like to mention early on in my reviews as well. In this case, it is a light matte anti-glare screen surface, so it offers good glare handling, but it also has a bit of an effect on the image. It isn't the smoothest screen surface I've come across, the smoothest matte screen surface, so there's a little bit of graininess, but it's not a heavy or smeary graininess. It doesn't look like there's an obvious layered effect in front of the image, which some monitors have, so it is still a light matte screen surface. It's really quite typical for these 27-inch WQHD VA models. It's really something that most users won't worry about. It's just something I'm quite sensitive to. So if you observe lighter shades such as the sky here and the clouds, they kind of have a light mistiness to them from the screen surface, but not an obvious heavy smeary graininess. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. The stand design is quite robust. It has a powder-coated metal base to it here, and it also has powder-coated metal for the stand neck behind that. As you can see, I've just adjusted the height of the monitor. It does offer good ergonomic flexibility in terms of its height adjustment. It also lets you swivel it left and right a bit. And you can also tilt it backwards and forwards. You can't rotate it into portrait, so it doesn't offer pivot, but that's quite normal for curved monitors because curved monitors in portrait look really quite weird. It doesn't really have the desired effect with the curve. You can see that the central area there, the Elite logo, that's actually glossy plastic. I'm not a huge fan of this, to be honest. It's a dust magnet, fingerprint magnet. It's reflective. The surrounding matte is really much more practical. I prefer that. And as I mentioned, the powder-coated metals, I like that for the stand base. It's a nice solid feel to that. So the bottom bezel is quite thick, as you can see, but the top and side bezels, they're dual stage design. So there is a slender panel border, which is flush with the rest of the screen. You can see it just blends in quite nicely when the screen's off, as it is now, but when it's switched on, you'll be able to see it more clearly. And there's also a thin, hard plastic outer component. Something I like to mention as well, the bezels have slight notches. Might not be able to see this in the video, really tiny notches on this model, just right at the top right, top left as well. It just looks like there's a very small section of the panel border missing, but that's actually intentional. It's one of the calibration marks used when the panel is put together. So overall, I don't mind the design. I do quite like the use of the powder-coated metal, quite stealthy look, a bit gamery. I'm not really too fussed about gamery designs myself. But one thing I would say is it's quite deep as well. The stand base actually has a tripod design. There's a leg that goes at the back there. So that really means that the screen is quite far forwards. The stand is quite deep. It takes up quite a lot of depth on the desk. So if you don't have the deepest desk, you might find that the screen is a bit closer to your face than you'd want. My desk is reasonably deep, so I didn't really have an issue with it, and I can sit back in my chair and stuff, and I found it fine, but just be aware of that. The screen surface is curved, as I mentioned earlier, so again, it's something which is exaggerated when you look at videos and pictures of the monitor, but in practice it's pretty natural, easy to adapt to. Screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so it offers decent glare handling, and it offers better retention of vibrancy and clarity to the image than stronger matte screen surfaces, and doesn't have as much of a grainy look as some matte screen surfaces, and I mentioned that elsewhere in the review. From the side, you can really appreciate how deep the stand design actually is, but the screen itself is reasonably slender. You can see the stand is certainly robust. I think that's an appropriate word to use in this case. At the rear, you're greeted by more of this nasty glossy plastic for the central region, but the rest of it is more practical black matte plastic, and as I mentioned earlier, the sides of the stand actually going all the way up, that's powder-coated metal. I don't really know why they put the glossy plastic in the middle, for a little bit of visual interest, I guess. I'm not really too bothered about it at the back because my wall doesn't really care what materials are used at the back. However, I do find the matte plastic more practical. I don't like the fingerprint magnet, dirt magnet, dust magnet, glossy plastic. It's just quite annoying, to be honest. The ViewSonic logo has that a little bit as well, but it's just a little logo at the top there. Just a little sort of engraved logo, not a big deal. Actually, you can't see them at all unless they're switched on, but there are some RGB LED lights, and they're explored in the OSD video. You can have different flashing patterns and various things that you can do with them, but you can just see them now. Makes the rear look a bit quite interesting, actually, quite attractive, except really my wall, as I mentioned, doesn't care about that. But you can see the ones at the bottom as well, glowing onto the desk. This isn't a completely dark room either, it's reasonably bright. So, you know, the ones at the bottom, at least, you can actually see them even if the room is not completely dark. So that could be something you might appreciate. There's also a little flip down headphone hook there, which is a neat little feature. It's just plastic, but it's quite solid actually. I quite like the design of that one. The included stand attaches using a quick release mechanism, so if you push that up, you can easily remove the screen from the included stand, or the stand from the screen if you prefer, and that will reveal 100 by 100mm VESA holes for alternative mounting. The ports of the monitor face downwards. The first one there is a mini USB port, and that is for the Elite Display Controller, which is a little accessory you can get for this monitor and other monitors in the Elite series. I'm not sure if that accessory is actually available yet. I couldn't work out where you actually buy it from. It didn't seem to be in ViewSonic's shop either. So perhaps that's something that they may have in the future, but that's really what that port's for. There are two HDMI 2.0 ports which support up to 144 Hz at the native 2560 by 1440, and they also support AMD FreeSync plus HDR. There's then a DisplayPort 1.4 port, and that supports the full functionality of the monitor, including the 165 Hz refresh rate, 2560 by 1440, adaptive sync, including AMD FreeSync, and with some clear caveats, at least on our GPU, NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, and HDR all at the same time. There's a 3.5mm headphone jack. There is a USB 3.2 upstream port and 3 USB 3.2 downstream ports, plus a DC power input. So this monitor has an external power brick rather than an internal converter. And one thing I'd say about the ports, they're located beneath this little removable port cover. I just clipped it off here. So you'll notice I had that on when I was showing you the rear of the monitor. Keeps things a little bit neater, and you can kind of just route the cables through the middle of that instead. But I did find the port area a bit cramped. It's actually a very difficult area to film properly, even with the camera. The ports really are very cramped up. And it's all right once you've connected everything up, but I did actually find it a little bit difficult to connect the power cable because it's really very close to the edge there, and there's kind of like a bit of a lip at the top there. So it's a little bit awkward for port access, to be honest. I'm not a massive fan of the design in terms of the port location there. There's a little mouse bungee, so this is a little rubberized clip, and you can feed your mouse cable through that if you use a wired mouse. I have a wireless mouse, so I have no need for this, but if you do use a wired or corded mouse, you can have that just keep your mouse cable in place. It's got little teeth to help it grip to the cord as well. There's just one of those. I know the XG270QC, that has another one at the other side, but there's only one on this model. There's the OSD joystick in the middle there, the RGB LED lighting feature there, which is explored in the OSD video, or part of the RGB LED lighting feature, I should say, and the OSD controls. There are also two 3-watt speakers. They're down firing, so this is the bottom of the monitor. And they offer quite good sound output, actually. They're explored a bit in the written review, but they're quite decent sound output as far as integrated monitor speakers go. I'm now going to focus on the contrast performance of the monitor. So to start off, because it's a VA vertical alignment panel, I like to talk a bit about Black Crush. And it's a bit easier to set the scene with this using some out-of-game examples. So I've got here what I call the PCM Black Crush test. So what this is it's a black square, but it has some very dark grey text that says PCM on it. But when you view this text in the central region, or the region of the screen that's in line with your eyes, or in this case the camera, it appears very well blended. Whereas if you observe that same text lower down the screen or towards the sides, at the very edges, it's perhaps a bit clearer towards the bottom, you can see that you can now see PCM quite clearly. It lifts it up. The PCM actually becomes, if anything, slightly more visible than it should be. But centrally again, it just becomes very well blended and actually less visible than it should be. So this is what Black Crush is all about, these perceived gamma shifts. So the perceived gamma for these dark shades is much higher towards the center of the screen, or the area in line with your eyes, whereas lower down the screen, or areas sort of a bit more peripherally to your eyes, the perceived gamma is reduced for these dark shades, and that means they're lighter than intended versus a bit darker than intended. This is certainly something which all VA models have to some degree. On this one, it's not bad at all. It's about as low as I've seen on a VA model, actually, this Black Crush. On some, it's certainly more pronounced, but it does still have an effect. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about contrast using some in-game examples. So this has a VA panel, and under my test settings, the static contrast was just a little bit shy of 3000 to 1, which is specified for the panel, and that's a much stronger contrast than you'd get from IPS or TN models. And this allows darker shades to have superior depth. I wouldn't really call it an inky look if you're sitting in a dark room as I am now, but it's certainly superior depth to what you get from the other LCD panel types. So for games like this, where there's plenty of dark areas, dark tombs, caves, interior locations, that kind of thing, with just a few sort of point sources of light illuminating things most of the time, then it really does help to have this strong static contrast. It gives a good atmospheric look to such scenes. Being a VA panel, it does have some VA glow, and this is a slight bloom that you see more towards the bottom of the screen from a normal viewing position. You can kind of see a bit of a hazing in the video. It's kind of difficult to capture this in a video accurately, but you certainly do see this to the eye, more so towards the bottom of the screen from a normal viewing position. And it does eat away at some of the atmosphere and some of the detail as well, but it isn't as extensive as IPS glow. It doesn't have as strong a bloom, and it doesn't eat away at the atmosphere to the same extent. Although to some people it's still quite noticeable because of the fact that the shade depth is superior towards the central mass of the screen, so there's kind of that contrast there compared to IPS models where the glow versus the rest of the screen, perhaps it doesn't have quite the same contrast to it. But in my view, the overall atmosphere on this monitor is nice for darker content. And this VA glow isn't actually as strong as I've seen on some VA models. Just looking at the 27-inch WQHD models, it's quite similar to the AOC CQ270G2 or G2U that I reviewed not too long ago. And as I mentioned on that, the VA glow was lower than, for example, the Samsung C27 HD70 that I looked at, but it is worth bearing in mind that there are some factors that can affect the glow. So it's going to be more intense if you're sitting closer to the monitor. It'll be more intense if you're using a higher brightness on the monitor. And if you've got a unit with some uniformity issues such as bad backlight bleed or clouding, then that can bring out the VA glow more strongly. My unit's quite good in that respect. You can actually see that in the written review in the contrast section. That's where that's explored. I've lightened up the room just a bit just to show you the fact that the VA glow is a lot less noticeable. Actually, you can see glare on the screen because I've got some light behind the monitor, which isn't really ideal. But the point is that in many lighting conditions, the overall atmosphere is nice and it is noticeably better than other LCD panel types. You also have these bright elements which stand out nicely against the darker surroundings. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of graininess to the screen surface. Nothing intense, nothing extreme, nothing that I think is going to really bother most people. It is something I'm sensitive to though, so it's something I like to point out and talk about. And I know some other users are also sensitive to this. So it is an important factor to consider. So it isn't the smoothest matte screen surface out there, but it is still light and the surface texture isn't overly grainy, doesn't have an obvious smeary look to it or anything like that. I'm now on Lagom, that's lagom.nl, and the tests for viewing angles, and these are really good for highlighting weaknesses in colour consistency. So this Lagom text test, it should appear a blended grey throughout ideally. There can be some subtle striping colours to the striping of the text, and in this case, because it's a VA panel, it does have some viewing angle weaknesses and some issues with the gamma curve related to that. So you get this kind of cone in the centre of the screen where it appears nice and blended, but further out there is a red striping to the text, or sort of a rusty brown colour to a more saturated red lower down. And this cone that's more blended, this moves along with head movement, and this kind of cone effect is really very similar to what causes the black crush. Of course, these are lighter shades, so the gamma shifts are a bit different here, but there are still gamma shifts in play, which mean that the area centrally is more blended, whereas further out it's less blended. And with more extreme head movements, you can see the text sort of all over the place in terms of its colour shifting. But what you don't get from a normal viewing position, you don't get this obvious gradient between kind of green and red and strongly saturated shades that you get on TN models. So it's kind of quite middle ground in terms of the viewing angles, as usual for VA panel. You've got the purple block, and that appears largely a pinkish purple, and this is very difficult to actually show in the video. It tends to even invert the colours slightly sometimes. I'm not sure exactly why it does that. But anyway, to the eye, it appears largely a pinkish purple, but it has more of a vibrant violet colour to it, so more of a sort of blue bias, if you will, towards the edges, and particularly towards the bottom of the screen. And I'm sorry again about the camera kind of flashing between these things. It's very difficult to stop that. But the consistency here is better than you'd see on a TN model. However, the kind of pink hue, it does shift along with head movement. And again, I have no idea what this weird flashing is all about. I've tested various different settings and it seems to keep coming up. It's just on the camera, not on the monitor itself. Don't worry about it. But basically the pink hue does shift along with head movement. Hopefully it'll stop flashing on the next shade. The red block appears quite a striking red throughout actually. It's fairly consistent, although it has a little bit more of a sort of burnt red or a kind of duller appearance really towards the bottom of the screen and the side edges, but more so towards the bottom. And this is exaggerated if you sit close to the monitor. It really looks quite dull towards the edges if you sit quite close. Further back, the effect's reduced. This is all, again, related to viewing angle weaknesses. For my normal viewing position, it would be about 70 centimeters from the screen, give or take a bit. But from that, it's really not too extreme, the shift on this shade. And certainly if you compare to, again, a TN model, you don't get the obvious gradient from top to bottom. A nice saturated green chartreuse shade, appearing very nice there. Really good consistency there. A little bit of extra yellowing towards the bottom of the screen, but nothing extreme. The blue block, that appears a good rich royal blue throughout. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So this monitor has a fairly vibrant look to colours overall, and that is in large part due to the fact it has some extension beyond sRGB in its colour gamut. So this game's running under SDR, and that means that the developers have the sRGB colour space in mind when they're creating this content. And if you're viewing it on a monitor with a wider colour gamut than that, so you've got some extension beyond that, as you do in this case, you get extra saturation and extra vibrancy. I actually measured 90% DCI-P3 coverage, so that's quite a bit of extension beyond sRGB. Not extreme, but certainly some extension, and enough to give an edge in vibrancy, inject a little bit of extra vibrancy. As I mentioned with Lagom, there are some shifts in colour, so some saturation is lost lower down the screen and towards the edges, but it's not extreme, at least for my viewing position around 70 centimeters from the screen. The shifts are not massively pronounced, but they are there, so you don't get the richness and the saturation maintained throughout the entire screen as you would with a decent IPS type model. But these autumnal colours, there's some nice deep, but there are certainly some nice autumnal reds and brown shades and oranges, and the fire here really has quite impressive vibrancy to it actually. Some of the oranges look a bit too deep and kind of verge on red because of the colour gamut, and some of the yellows really verge too much on orange, so it doesn't really look accurate or as the developers intend in that respect. But it does look vibrant, and you do get the variety. So an important thing to bear in mind is that with a large colour gamut giving you this vibrancy, it's very different to if you were to just increase NVIDIA's digital vibrance control or the saturation slider in your graphics driver, or indeed use a saturation control on the monitor. Because what that does is it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut itself, and you lose the shade variety. Whereas here, it has good variety to the shades. That's maintained very nicely. And actually, to show you, this monitor does have a saturation slider. I'll just quickly show you that. And what happens if you increase that massively? So you can see here under color adjust, color saturation 50, the default. If you increase that, you'll notice the fire has a loss of shade range. You should notice by this point, just to show you a really extreme example, it now looks really cartoonish. It's basically just very red with a bit of kind of orange in the middle, whereas if you reduce that to more appropriate levels, there's just a better subtle variety of shades. That perhaps wasn't the best example because it's still pretty intense even now, but to the eye, certainly a better nuanced shade variety now. The extra saturation with these red shades, it also applies to some of the browns for, none in this particular scene, but just observing more generally, some of the brown shades of the wood for the trees, for example. They naturally have a slight reddish hue, but that's brought out a bit too strongly, so it doesn't appear quite as neutral as it should. And there are some green shades, again not here in this particular scene. Perhaps this green up here. It has slightly too much of a yellow cast because it does naturally have some yellow components to it. And they're brought out too strongly, a bit too strongly. It's not extreme though, it doesn't look like nuclear fallout or something weird from a film or a game, but it does just have slightly too much of a yellow hue. But there are some rich greens, some deep greens, some dark greens, actually even some shown here, some of the darker greens here, which really look rather lush and nice, but again, there's some saturation lost, and things look a little bit duller for some shades towards the edge of the screen and the bottom of the screen, so do be aware of that. I'm back with Lara Croft on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Don't Tell My Wife, and I'm going to talk about HDR, High Dynamic Range. So this monitor is VESA Display HDR 400 compliant, so that's the lowest level of HDR that VESA certifies for. So this does bring some things to the table. It now has 10-bit colour support, whereas under SDR your games will pretty much always just support 8-bit colour at most. And this means that there's an extra nuanced shade variety for these dark shades, these closer matching dark shades. So shadow detailing is better, it just has a better nuanced shade variety. And this is really achieved in a very natural way compared to a kind of gamma enhancement which you could apply under SDR, or manufacturer of a monitor could apply under SDR as well. The fact that you have a greater variety of shades gives a very different look to this, a nice natural look to these darker shades. It also affects the brighter shades, I'll come on to that shortly. But just to be aware that this monitor isn't actually 10-bit, it doesn't support 10-bit on the monitor itself, so the GPU is adding some dithering here, 8-bit on the monitor and 2-bit dithering on the GPU, but I've tested various monitors, including some which use dithering on the monitor versus the GPU depending on the refresh rate you're running at. For bandwidth reasons it might offload the dithering to the GPU, and the end result is really very similar, so don't obsess about this, it's still 10-bit processing for the pipeline. The other aspect of HDR is, of course, brightness and contrast, and this model offers very good dynamic contrast. It's very reactive. So if I stand here, for example, the scene is predominantly darker shades or medium to dark shades, and the backlight does dim very effectively, so that gives better atmosphere to these kind of scenes. But if you introduce some brighter shades, so I move the camera slightly so there's some very bright daylight streaming in from the sides, because it doesn't have local dimming, it means that the whole backlight has to adjust according to what's shown on the screen, and to really kind of give those brighter shades a good bright look, it does have to lift the luminance levels up for everything quite a lot, and you'll see the shift when I move even slightly. Now this shift is exaggerated on the camera, it looks really extreme on the video, but even to my eye, especially when you're sitting in a dark room like this, you can notice these shifts. So it's very reactive dynamic contrast, and it's good in terms of the depth and atmosphere for these predominantly darker scenes, but it does always adjust itself, and there are certainly plenty of times where you've got a mixture of light and dark on the screen, and the depth of those dark shades is really eaten away because of that. It does help that it's a VA model as well, so naturally it has better native contrast. If you had this kind of thing on an IPS model, you'd start seeing extreme IPS glow, and you'd just see the depth completely gone, and things would look quite flooded a lot of the time. So at least it has the VA contrast edge as well on its side. And as for these brighter shades, I'm actually going to show you a bit further down here, because I really like the scene down here. The monitor actually does quite well with these predominantly brighter scenes. There is plenty of brightness, and I'm just going to adjust my camera settings because this just looks like a giant ball of light. In reality, it's not like that at all. You can actually see more of the detail, and again, you can't appreciate this on the video, I'm afraid. It's just how things work, but to the eye, there is the greater nuanced shade variety gives a really nice smooth look to the gradients, the sort of rays of sunshine there. Really nice nuanced shade variety here as well, and that's something which gives a very different look to scenes like this under HDR, and this monitor does certainly do a good job in that respect. The glint of light on the water there, quite bright as well. So this monitor, although it's VESA Display HDR 400 certified, I actually measured close to 600 candles per meter squared peak luminance, so it actually boosts a bit above that. So it's got a powerful backlight, and it does bring quite good brightness to these scenes. But again, it is universal brightness, so the depth isn't there for these darker shades, and it just doesn't look really as dynamic as it should. So it's not a true HDR experience in that respect at all. But even so, some users will still quite like the overall effect of HDR, and it certainly does bring very high brightness to these bright elements. Just a shame that the surrounding darker shades aren't deeper at the same time. The aspect of HDR is colour reproduction, and I mentioned earlier that some of these green shades, I was actually using Battlefield examples, but it's really a more general point. Some of the yellowish green shades, the yellows are brought out too strongly under SDR because of the colour gamut, but now with HDR, the game developers are actually targeting the DCI-P3 colour space, and that means that these yellowish greens are toned down. Things look nice and lush, things look nice and vivid, but they look more natural as well. Laura's skin tone as well, it appears a bit too tanned under SDR, whereas under HDR that's toned down a bit. There are some saturation shifts, so again, when you see her skin towards the bottom of the screen, it actually looks a little bit undersaturated, particularly under HDR, but at least centrally, her beautiful visage there looks more appropriate under HDR. So, as I mentioned earlier, 90% DCI-P3 coverage on this monitor. HDR near-term target is really DCI-P3, although Rec 2020 is the ultimate goal, so it can help to have an even more generous colour gamut than this model uses, but it still does inject some nice vibrancy where the developers want it. So these blue flowers here, for example, they really do catch the eye, and they have some shades which are well beyond the sRGB colour space, and the deep greens around it there as well have a certain lushness to them, and just the palette of greens more broadly. What I would say again though, they could be more eye-catching, they could be lusher, they could be some even more eye-catching vivid shades, but that would require extra extension in the colour gamut, and again there is a bit of saturation loss lower down, so the blue doesn't look quite as intense, neither does the green towards the bottom of the screen. Just again not extreme, not as you'd see on a TN model. Not that TN models typically offer HDR support anyway, but you know, just a more general point. And also the clothing here, the oranges and reds of the dresses and the clothing, it stands out quite nicely. But you have to remember, again, because the backlight is very strong, you know, high brightness, that can cause some shades to look a little bit more muted under HDR situationally, and you do kind of have an overall loss of depth because the backlight brightness is very strong for scenes like this. So that's again where local dimming could really help things. Just a final point on HDR, actually a final few points. One is that you really don't have much adjustment in the OSD. So when you're running HDR, you'll see that game mode is grayed out, view mode is grayed out, various other things are grayed out, and if you go to color adjust, you can't change things like the gamma. Sorry if you can't see this on the video, it's kind of flooding it out a little bit because of the high brightness. But the gamma's grayed out, color saturation, you can't change the color channels. So there's really very little you can actually control under HDR, but that's quite normal. It's quite normal for things to be closely controlled by the monitor, and it's just how things often are. The important thing to note though is that if you're using HDMI, the representation of HDR is slightly different, and at least on my unit it was, the gamma was quite a bit higher when I was using HDMI. So I've got the monitor connected using DisplayPort at the moment. So all of my observations I've made so far and I've talked about there with the DisplayPort. HDMI, it doesn't really dramatically change things in terms of the backlight control is exactly the same. So a lot of the points I'm making still apply. The color reproduction is a bit different though, and that's because of the higher gamma. So things tend to look deeper and more saturated overall. It kind of gives a more cinematic look, really. Some users might prefer that, but it actually pushes things too far, and some of the darker shades are too blended together. So the nuanced shade variety is, I mean, it's still there, but it's kind of lost a bit. But again, it's really just down to personal preferences. And of course, if you're using an HDR-capable games console, you will be using HDMI. So do be aware that things will look a bit deeper, more cinematic. And again, some people might like that. I personally tend to prefer the look that it gives under DisplayPort. It's kind of more natural, more accurate. Although again, I really do prefer HDR when it has good local dimming, but at least they've got good dynamic contrast, which helps a bit with the predominantly darker scenes, and a nice powerful backlight, which does pump out some good luminance under HDR. And just the very final point is that when you're running under HDR, a sharpness filter is applied, and you can't control that in the OSD, you can't disable that, you can't change that. So it's sort of really designed to accentuate some of the extra nuanced shade variety and the potential contrast boosts, although in this case there isn't local dimming, so that doesn't really apply. But it's something which I don't really mind, but it's very subjective. On monitors like this with a reasonable pixel density, I don't find it's too obvious and sort of distracting or anything like that. It kind of just works fairly nicely in my view, but people have their own opinions, and it would have been nice to be able to control that according to your own preferences. But really the HDR performance here, it's one of the better VESA Display HDR 400 level performances I've seen. Certainly room for improvement. It certainly isn't true HDR, but still offers some benefits and just gives a very different look to things, which is nice for a bit of variety. I'm now on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor uses a 165Hz panel, and this means that it outputs up to 2.75 times as much information every second as a 60Hz monitor, or indeed this monitor running at 60Hz. So this has two main advantages. One is that it improves the connected feel, so that's the precision, the fluidity you feel when you're interacting with the game world. It's also important to consider input lag when you think about connected feel, and on this model I measured a bit below 5 milliseconds. You can see the exact figure in the written review at the start of the responsiveness section. So this isn't a super low level of input lag, but it's certainly low, and the signal delay element, which is really the main element you feel, is nice and low, and it's really the pixel response element which fills out the rest of that input lag. Some users are quite sensitive to the pixel response element as well, and that can certainly add to the sensation that, you know, things aren't quite as snappy as they might like at times, more so with some transitions than others, and I'll come on to pixel responsiveness shortly. But it's really the signal delay which most people feel, And when you couple the low signal delay with the 165 Hz refresh rate at suitable frame rates, it does have a nice fluidity and connected feel in my opinion. And you can see the frame rate in the top right there, 165, a nice solid 165 frames a second, so I'm making full use of the refresh rate. The other aspect to consider is that the perceived blur is reduced by this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination. And there's an article on the website all about responsiveness which covers this, and there's a bit of a summary in the written review in the responsiveness section. So the concept of perceived blur is certainly an important one to grasp when it comes to monitor responsiveness. So you get a huge reduction in perceived blur due to eye movement, and it's actually this which causes most of the perceived blur you see on a monitor. But you also have to take into account the pixel responses. Now, as a VA model, it's quite typical for there to be some degree of weakness with pixel responses, some more so than others. And with this model, there certainly are some weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. But before going on to that, it's important to also talk a little bit about the pixel overdrive, the response time settings, the grey-to-grey acceleration, if you like, on this monitor, because it offers quite a bit of flexibility, or seems to offer quite a bit of flexibility. So you can see them listed here in the OSD, in the display section of the OSD, as response time OD. I use the fastest setting, and to be honest, the differences between most of these settings, it's really very subtle, and it's not really enough to show you on the video. It doesn't really make much of a difference. It's just progressively slightly faster pixel responses in some cases, but it really doesn't make a huge dramatic difference. The one exception to that is this fastest setting. I've currently got my color temperature set to native. If you have this set to anything there except for full color control, then you can really get this kind of experience I'm going to show you now, where there is minimal overshoot and the pixel responses are about as fast as this panel can really produce without producing loads of overshoot. If, however, you change to full color control, this fastest setting changes. It doesn't actually matter what you change these values to, it's just when you activate the full color control, so you access the red, green and blue color channels, maybe you want to make manual adjustments. This completely changes how this fastest setting reacts, and it gives extreme overshoot. You'll be able to see this very clearly in the video, this bright colourful cyan trailing all over the place. But honestly, don't sweat too much. If you have to make these adjustments to the red, green and blue colour channels, just use the ultra fast setting, because as I said, there's really minimal difference except for this fastest setting if you compare this to using one of the other colour settings at the same time. A little bit confusing, I know. If you really want to use this fastest setting and you still want to make some adjustments to the colour channels, you could activate the low blue light setting. So if you look at the test settings in the written review, you'll see that I managed to use the native setting, but I make some slight adjustments to the blue colour channel using the low blue light setting instead. Of course, if your green channel's way out of whack, you can't do that. That's not going to help you very much. So back now to my preferred native setting for the colour temperature. Most of the pixel transitions in this scene, they occur between medium and lighter shades, and the monitor doesn't really perform too badly here. There are some slight weaknesses, so you get some powdery trailing, or what I like to call powdery trailing in places. So behind the wall here, for example, there's just a little bit of a kind of light powdery trail around when you move the mouse. Again, it's not something you'll be able to necessarily observe on the video, but to my eye I can see it, and it does slightly increase the overall perceived blur, but it's really quite minor. So for scenes like this, it does make decent use of the 165 Hz refresh rate. I wouldn't say perfect use, certainly not, but it still gets some decent advantage from it. There are some more notable weaknesses. So where it says open range there, you've got a very bright shade against a medium to darker background. There's what I'd call heavy powdery trailing, and there are some darker shades here a bit further up, and a good example is this dark shadowy section of wall there against the sky, and this introduces some smeary trailing. So these are much slower than optimal, these pixel transitions. I'll give some more specific examples of that shortly. But this particular example, on some VA models I've actually seen it look more smoke-like, it kind of extends further out. So it's not so bad here, but it is certainly there. And some users are of course sensitive to this kind of thing and will find it a little bit annoying. But not everyone does. So don't just write this monitor off because of this kind of weakness. It might not bother you, and you do have to certainly consider it and balance it up against the other factors of the monitor. There's also a bit of overshoot in places, but nothing extreme. It's quite light overshoot, nothing extreme like I showed you with the fastest setting when you had the full color control active at the same time. That was really very distracting. And again, that's actually, I thought this was going to show overshoot, this example, but it's actually powdery trailing you've got behind the rocks there, with the sky in the background. But for some slightly different transitions, it's usually between lighter to medium shades. There's actually a better example of it here. It's a bit brighter, just at the edge there, with the sky in the background. I'm not sure if this will come across on the video, because it's not super bright, it's not super strong, but it is there. And when I talk about adaptive sync shortly, this does become stronger. These overshoot examples do become stronger at lower refresh rates, which will occur if your frame rate dips and you've got adaptive sync active. So I will take that into account a little bit later. But just talking about the 165 Hz performance at the moment, not too bad at all in terms of overshoot. I'm now on a different scene on Battlefield 5, and this one is great for highlighting these kind of transitions which VA models in particular struggle with. There are plenty of darker shades moving against brighter shades, so those high contrast transitions, plenty of darker shades against medium shades as well, so a really nice spread of transitions, but focusing on these darker shades. And this is really where that smeary trailing becomes more noticeable. So the flag post there, for example, has quite a noticeable sort of black trail behind it, and the flag itself does as well. Certainly not as smeary or as extended as I've seen on some VA models, I have to say. And the canoes down here, they always show this off nicely, especially with the circular motion. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, I don't circle my mouse when I'm playing a game, but this is just to demonstrate it. It's just a specific example. You can see it with the rock there as well quite clearly. Certainly a smeary look to the trailing there, because these transitions are far slower than optimal. And just the overall perceived blur, it's certainly not as low as it could be for 165 Hz. So there's plenty of darker transitions here. The makeshift roof here as well always shows off this smeary trailing very nicely. And the flag post here and this tree. So I've shown this off with various different monitors before, or shown this with various different monitors before, and it is very typical for VA models to struggle here, but there's still some are better than others. This one, I'd really consider it quite middle ground in terms of its performance, so I'd say it's quite similar to the AOC CQ270G2 or CQ270G2U, which we reviewed not too long ago, and I made some comparisons with other models in that review, so certainly feel free to check that out. But essentially, it's just to say there are some models that are faster and some that are slower. I think it's really fair to put this somewhere in the middle. But of course, the AOC had a slightly lower refresh rate as well. And just to draw some comparisons, 165 Hz is not a huge difference from 144 Hz, to be honest. It's really quite a subtle difference. It just gives you a slight edge and connected feel, provided you've got the frame rate to match, and also a slight decrease in perceived blur. But it's nothing major, and it certainly isn't like going up from 60 Hz to 144 Hz with a suitable frame rate. That really makes a dramatic difference. There's also a little bit of overshoot mixed in here, but nothing too obnoxious. Sometimes you can see some dirty trailing, some overshoot around the light here, and this isn't just for VA panels, by the way, it's quite common on various other models. This one doesn't have it, although there is some overshoot on the post itself, a bit lower down, so slightly different transitions showing the overshoot here. So there's some kind of colourful cyan and magenta trailing, but it really sticks very close to the object, and it's not super bright or anything like that, so it doesn't really catch the eye too much. And of course, if you're very sensitive to overshoot, you can actually get rid of this. So you could just use the ultra fast setting instead of the fastest setting. So I've just switched over to the ultra fast setting, and now you'll see that the overshoot has, well, it hasn't actually gone completely, but it is diminished, so it's virtually invisible. I don't know how this will come across on the video, but what I would say as well is, and yes, it's gone around the tree as well, it's not there, but the smeary trailing has actually increased slightly. But I wouldn't say this is a dramatic difference. If you're sensitive to this kind of thing, the smeary trailing, you're really going to notice it with either setting, so it's not a massive difference. I would refer to the pursuit photographs in the written review for a bit of a better example of the kind of differences we're talking about here between these different pixel overdrive settings. Nothing massive, nothing major. I've now got my obnoxiously loud AMD GPU in my system, and I'm going to talk about FreeSync. So I've got FreeSync enabled, and this means that the monitor is trying to match the frame rate of the content with its refresh rate. So you'll see the top right there, it's got my frame rate counter, and that's sort of all over the place because my AMD GPU, it's an RX 580, it's not massively powerful. Even though I've got the settings on the game quite low, there's plenty of fluctuation, around 100 frames a second on average I'd say at the moment, maybe a little bit beyond that. But without the technology, it gives obvious tearing if VSync's disabled, or it gives obvious stuttering if VSync's enabled. So getting rid of this tearing and stuttering from these frame rate and refresh rate mismatches is certainly a nice thing. Of course, sensitivity to tearing and stuttering does vary, so not everyone is as sensitive as I am to these things. But for me and for others who are sensitive to this kind of thing, it can be very nice to have this technology. Something else I didn't really mention earlier but is worth noting is that the weaknesses in pixel responsiveness, they don't always manifest as distinct trailing. It also means that there are often fine mixtures of lighter and darker shades, such as this patch of vegetation here, for example. And that alternation between dark and light shades, when you move the mouse, you'll be able to see this on the video actually, it can manifest as a kind of flickering sensation. And that's because the lighter shades are basically blending into the darker shades due to these weaknesses in pixel responsiveness. And that happens when you move the mouse, but when you stop moving the mouse, the shades brighten up again to their native state. So you can see slight movements can cause a sort of flickering sensation. This isn't specific to this model, it's a very typical VA weakness, and actually some IPS models show this kind of thing at times as well. Speaking of flickering though, it can be an issue more broadly with VA models, but when you're using adaptive sync specifically, and that's because they're very sensitive to the voltage changes that occur when your refresh rate is fluctuating a lot. But this model isn't bad at all in that respect actually. It doesn't really have any obvious flickering, or what I call obvious flickering. There can be some slight flickering at times if there's a sudden massive change in the frame rate, but it's only very brief and only very slight. So I really wouldn't worry about it on this model. It's also worth mentioning that at around 100 frames a second, as I am now, these weaknesses in pixel responsiveness with this smeary trailing, they're not quite as distinct as they are at 165 Hz because the pixel response requirements are reduced, but they're certainly still there. And what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't recommend just running this monitor at 100 Hz instead of 165 because of this, to try and sort of decrease the smeary trailing, because actually there's still a lot of benefit to be had from the higher refresh rate if you've got a frame rate to match. And that's not something that adaptive sync is going to help you with either, because lower frame rates are still lower frame rates. You do get a drop off in connected feel and an increase in overall perceived blur. So although some of this trailing may not be quite as distinct, you do still have an overall increase in perceived blur here. I've now increased the graphics settings further, so I'm actually a bit below 60 frames a second now, and the overshoot has increased slightly more. So if you do find this distracting, all I'd recommend you do is use the ultra fast setting for response time OD. And that reduces it. It is still there a bit actually, but it is reduced. And if you decrease it further, it will disappear. So if you use the faster setting, it's really pretty much gone now. Although with this faster setting here, there is a bit of extra smeary trailing, just a bit. And this certainly increases where your pixel response requirements are tightest. So as your refresh rate is increasing a lot more than this, so if it suddenly went back up sort of into the triple digits. So it's a bit of a compromise really. I think most people would probably be okay just sticking to the fastest setting, or perhaps the ultra fast. And the ultra fast setting actually works quite nicely across the range of refresh rates. There's not a huge difference between the ultra fast and the fastest setting. So I've got the fastest setting back again, and you'll see that my frame rate is 52 or 53 frames a second at the moment. But you might also notice that this overshoot has actually diminished rather than increased, as you might expect. And the reason for that is that the monitor is now employing LFC, low frame rate compensation. So if I go into information on the setup menu, you can see V frequency, the vertical frequency of the display, the refresh rate in other words, the main one. So from this you can actually conclude that 48 Hz isn't the floor of operation. It seems to be 52 Hz or thereabouts. So that's when LFC kicks in. There's really not a big difference between 48 and 52, so I wouldn't worry about this particular aspect. But what this means is the refresh rate is now sticking to a multiple of the frame rate rather than matching it exactly. And when this is in play and it's just being used constantly, it's not a problem. It gets rid of tearing and stuttering just fine. But there is a bit of a sort of stuttering and also slight accompanying flickering when it first activates. The flickering isn't something you always see with LFC, but the stuttering is. Now the reason for the flickering is because you're basically getting a very sudden and large fluctuation in the refresh rate from say 52 to 105 Hertz, for example, very suddenly. So that can cause a bit of flickering, but it's not extreme flickering. However, if you are frequently passing the boundary, the stuttering at least could get quite annoying. But for most users, it's just going to be something that you occasionally pass, or if you're lucky, you don't pass at all because your frame rate's always nice and high. So it's not really something I'd worry about too much. To wrap up then, in terms of the design of the monitor, I do like a bit of metal. So I do like the base of the monitor, but it's not just the base, it's actually the whole of the stand neck as well, at the sides. Good powder coated metal, so it's a nice solid footing, nice solid look and feel to that. It also has the RGB lighting feature, which at least it's better than some features because it has that down firing effect, so it at least lights up the desk a little bit. So it's got the rainbow cycling effect at the moment. A bit subtle in a brighter room, but it's a bit dim as it is now. You can certainly see that. The lights on the back though, they only ever face the wall, and really it's not something you can appreciate. And I much prefer RGB lighting features which will completely light up the area behind the monitor, give a nice aura, a nice halo, can be used as a bias light to enhance perceived contrast. That's not what you get here. Good ergonomic flexibility with the stand as well. The screen's curve I found completely natural, easy to adapt to. The resolution, it's good for a 27-inch screen in my opinion. Nice pixel density, not extreme, but pretty good pixel density. A nice upgrade from Full HD certainly, and it gives you a decent amount of desktop real estate. In terms of the contrast performance, that was really the main strength of this monitor. It offered a good solid performance there. Had a bit of VA glow, that's quite usual, not an extreme amount though. But the static contrast was certainly enough to deliver a better experience in that respect than what you get on non-VA LCD panels. It just lifted things up, improved the depth of dark shades. There was also a bit of black crush, but about as low as I've seen on a VA model. So the overall contrast performance was quite pleasing. The screen surface had a bit of a graininess to it, but not too bad. Not like a heavy smeary graininess or anything like that, or an obvious layered appearance, which some matte screen surfaces give, but it wasn't as smooth as some, and it's something I'm quite sensitive to. So I think most people are going to be just fine with this. The colour gamut extends a fair bit beyond sRGB, 90% DCI-P3, still as generous as some models, but enough to inject some extra vibrancy, give some shades a more vivid appearance. And this of course is a double-edged sword. Some people like the kind of look that gives to your typical sRGB content that includes games running under SDR, which are designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. Gives you extra vibrancy, extra saturation. Some people like that, but it has good variety because it doesn't crush things together. It's not like a digital saturation boost which just pulls things close to the edge of the gamut without expanding the gamut. The actual expansion of the gamut, everything has good spacing on the gamut, so it does give a varied look still. But this monitor doesn't offer an sRGB emulation mode, so it can't effectively curtail that gamut. Colour consistency was about as strong as I've seen on a VA model as well, so not up to IPS type standards. So there was some losses of saturation, things looking a little bit duller towards the edge of the screen and the bottom of the screen, but nothing extreme, and certainly quite slight compared to your vertical shifts you get on TN models, for example, especially if you're sitting around 70 centimeters or further from the monitor, which I like to do where possible. The monitor also supports HDR, more specifically VESA Display HDR 400. So it will respond to HDR10 content. That puts the colour gamut to good use because DCI-P3 is now the target colour space by game developers and film content creators for HDR. Really, that's the near-term target, I should say. So with 90% DCI-P3 coverage, there is, it's fair to say that some elements aren't as vibrant as they could be. Certainly a more generous colour gamut would bring out extra vibrancy, but there's still some quite nice vibrant elements. Fires, for example, certain painted artifacts on Tomb Raider, flowers, that kind of thing. Some of Lara Croft's dresses stood out quite nicely and showcased some nice shades beyond the sRGB colour space. Meanwhile, you get a more natural look to the natural shades in your environment. So your earthy browns, for example, don't have an overly strong red cast, which you can get under SDR because of the colour gamut. So things are really toned down and more accurately represented in that respect. VESA Display HDR400 doesn't mandate local dimming, and this monitor doesn't have local dimming, but what it does have is it has a very effective dynamic contrast setting. Of course, that isn't as good as proper local dimming, but it does mean that at least for the darker shades, things dim nicely, the backlight dims nicely, gives a better atmosphere there, whereas for the brighter shades, the backlight comes on quite strongly, and the luminance levels were actually well in excess of the requirements for VESA Display HDR400. I measured just shy of 600 candle hours per meter squared, so it really has a nice powerful backlight. So certainly not a true HDR experience, but it's one of the better VESA Display HDR400 level displays I've come across. The responsiveness, bit of a mixed bag really, 165Hz, and that was nice to have. The pixel responses were quite mixed, sort of middling in terms of responsiveness for the panel type, and certainly some way off IPS type panels and TN models. So there were some distinct weaknesses in terms of smeary trailing, a little bit of overshoot in places, but nothing too extreme. Input lag was pretty low, and it does support adaptive sync. This worked with AMD FreeSync, as you would expect, and it got rid of tearing and stuttering from frame rate and refresh rate mismatches. You just have to use the slightly lower response time setting, or I'd recommend using a slightly lower response time setting, just to make sure you don't get the extra overshoot creeping in. It's according to preferences and taste really, but the ultra fast setting, which is just one down from the fastest setting, worked quite well at the lower refresh rates. And to be honest, the difference at the high refresh rates wasn't massive, it's just that the fastest setting did give a slight edge. Unfortunately, adaptive sync didn't work with G-Sync compatible mode on my GTX 10 series GPU. I have been trying to get hold of a newer GPU. I'm probably going to upgrade it to an RTX 3080 at some point, but I don't have that at the time of review, so I can't say how the monitor works with that. Although what I would say is sometimes there are monitors where there are issues with the GTX 10 series GPUs. You get screen blanks on this one, you get extra flickering, and you get stuttering as well over a broad range of refresh rates, but the screen blank's really the main sort of killer there, and this really means that the technology is completely unusable. But on some models where this occurs with the GTX 10 series, your RTX 20 series is fine, and I would assume your RTX 30 series is fine. Basically the newer GPUs don't have a problem there, but I don't know what the state of play is for this particular model. You might have to look out for user feedback on that one. It also has a strobe backlight setting, Pure XP. I don't really talk about that much in this video review, but that's because it's something which is better described and explained in a very specific way, using pursuit photography and using really words to describe the experience. Because on the video, it doesn't really supplement that in a useful way. You just see flickering from the screen on the video, but you don't see the benefits this brings. So it did work well in terms of reducing your perceived blur due to eye movement, but it was quite a messy strobe backlight setting really, had quite a lot of strobe crosstalk and various other issues which are explored in the written review. So I think really overall the responsiveness was not up to the levels that I've come to expect from ViewSonic's Elite series models. So I've looked at the XG240R, which was really very good for its class, the XG270QG, the Nano IPS model, also very good responsiveness for its class, very well tuned. This one, I think it makes decent enough use of the panel used, but that panel itself just isn't really particularly fast, and you can't really accelerate it properly without strong overshoots, so for some transitions, so it's a little bit tricky there. I still think, looking past the responsiveness, this monitor does offer quite a nice experience in terms of its contrast and colour reproduction, so it will really hit the spot for some people. For more casual gaming, perhaps where the responsiveness isn't such an issue, and I wouldn't say the responsiveness is awful, it's just something which is really very subjective, sensitivity varies to that. So it's really something you'll have to consider for yourself. But to draw a quick comparison, I think a model which really I have in my mind when I'm comparing this, it's the AOC CQ270G2 or G2U. The reason for that is that that model is significantly cheaper, but in terms of the core performance in many respects, it's actually very similar to this. So it is limited to 144 Hz, but there's not really a massive difference between that and 165 Hz. But it is a little bit of a bonus, and I know that does matter to some people, so do consider that. The overall pixel responsiveness is pretty similar. The contrast experience was similar. The color reproduction was broadly similar as well. So, you know, it's not really a massive difference that you get in terms of the core performance there, but what you are paying for with the ViewSonic, you get the 165 Hz refresh rate. You also get HDR capability, not a true HDR experience, but at least a reasonable VESA Display HDR 400 level experience. And you also get the more powerful backlight. I know some people like to really crank up the brightness, and you can certainly do that with this model. It has a nice powerful backlight. And of course the construction, you get the RGB LED lights, and you get that nice solid powder coated metal stand. So I know this kind of thing will matter to some people, and you know, for some this will be worth paying more for, but really if you're just interested in the core performance under SDR, then I think the AOC is worth careful consideration. So that's really all there is to the ViewSonic XG270QC. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.